Thank you very much for having me today. It's great to be with all of you at the Solutions Summit. To be clear, it would be a lot better to be there in person. I couldn't help but notice that the Pelican Institute is closing the summit with, and I quote, a cocktail reception and a toast to freedom while enjoying the sweeping views from atop the Baton Rouge Hilton, unquote. I have to say, that beats a lukewarm coffee and toasting my wife to surviving another day of remote learning while enjoying the not-so-sweeping views from our living room. Anyway, for those of you who don't know, I was a Louisiana resident once upon a time. After graduating from law school in 1997, I moved to New Orleans, where I lived literally around the corner from Commander's Palace, where I worked for a federal judge, and where I took in all Louisiana had to offer. I thought at the time, and I'm hard-pressed to rebut myself now, that it was one of the best years of my life. Something about Louisiana just drew me in. The people I met were the salt of the earth. Unlike here in Washington, they weren't so much concerned about what you did for a living or where you went to school as what your favorite restaurant was and who you were as a person. The places I saw were unique, from Ponchatoula during the Strawberry Festival to the Abita Brewery in Covington. Even the law was different. I found myself learning terms derived from the Napoleonic Code, like prescription and redhibition. To me, virtually everything about Louisiana was unique. Obviously, that's a feeling that millions of people the world over share. Louisiana has been a top tourist destination for many years for good reason. You've got to be a real Yankee curmudgeon not to break a bit of a smile when you hear terms like Mardi Gras or Jazz Fest. But of course, the very title of this event suggests that we're gathered here for more than sentimentality about a state that we love. There wouldn't be a need for a Solutions Summit if every economic issue had already been addressed. Sure, the state has a lot going for it, but for those, like you, who've been entrusted to lead and to govern, inertia isn't an option for the state. Nostalgia is not a strategy for long-term success. More than ever, state and local leaders need to be proactive to help create jobs and attract talent and capital. Well, so far, so good, but how do you do that? Well, before getting into particular ideas, I think it's important to spend a minute exploring how the pandemic has changed the way we live and work, and will live and work going forward. For one thing, I believe that there's a much broader appreciation today of the importance of innovation in helping society function compared to 1 year ago. I can't tell you how many conversations I've had where I've heard some variation of the following, often out of my own mouth. If this pandemic had hit 10 or 20 years ago, I don't know how we would have managed. 1 year ago this month, hundreds of millions of Americans shifted to working from and staying at home. Many wondered, myself among them, how would people do their jobs? How would kids learn? How would patients needing to avoid exposure get the healthcare they need? How would we stay connected with each other? And perhaps more mundane, but still worth considering, how would we entertain ourselves? Well, now we know the answers to these questions 1 long year later. Technology, reflecting years of innovation and hard work, stepped into the breach in a big way. In an instant, it became common practice to think of the word Zoom as a proper noun. Indeed, I feel like I've used a couple dozen video platforms over the past year. And they've enabled me to do countless meetings with people across the country and around the world, something that could not have happened had I been stuck at home in the analog age. And basic functions, like buying groceries or making groceries, as some of my New Orleans friends used to say, can now be done on an app, which is a remarkable convenience when you think about it. Thanks to broadband connections, patients and healthcare providers can benefit from telehealth. Kids have been able to download lesson plans, upload homework, and connect with teachers remotely. And streaming has become mainstream for so many, with shows like Tiger King, The Last Dance, and Queen's Gambit becoming the new water cooler topics. Needless to say, not everyone has been fortunate enough to take advantage of all of these tools. They may not have access to technology, or they may have access but not be able to afford it. Needless to say, we need to change that. But that underscores the basic point of my remarks today. We need to make sure that innovation finds a home everywhere. It helps local economies grow, and it ultimately helps everyone benefit from a concept that I've called digital opportunity. So, how do you help forge a forward-thinking state? I don't pretend to have all of the answers, but here are a few suggestions. First suggestion, policymakers can pave the way for job creation by making it easier to create jobs. There's an iron law of incentives. The harder it is to start and operate a business, the less likely it is that people will start and operate a business. This seems obvious, but it's not obvious to some, and it's harder to avoid this trap than some might think. Part of the solution here is to make basic reforms to the process of corporate formation. How easy is it to start a business in the state? Are there a lot of hoops to jump through or a lot of agencies to visit? How easy is it to access capital? Are there unusually onerous tax or insurance or other requirements that make entrepreneurs disfavor your state compared to others? The easier it is for an entrepreneur to make the transition from idea to implementation, the more likely it is that they'll execute and eventually start hiring. Another part of the solution here is to avoid looking at the new through the prism of the old. Here's what I mean. One of the biggest flashpoints in today's digital economy is how old rules should apply to new ways of doing business. Entrepreneurs, especially online entrepreneurs, are constantly coming up with new ways to benefit consumers. The most successful ones disrupt incumbent businesses. But often, they don't face the same regulatory landscape that incumbent businesses do. When that happens, the government's instinct is to apply legacy regulations to these newer companies. Sometimes, startups are slowed down by these rules. Sometimes they're stopped altogether. That's bad for entrepreneurship, and that's bad for consumers. An innovation-focused state should try to avoid shoehorning new services into old regulatory frameworks, even when it's a poor fit. Instead, the government should ask whether consumers are benefiting from these new services, products, and modes of distribution. If they are, and if there's no systematic evidence of fraud or misrepresentation against consumers, the government shouldn't establish artificial roadblocks to competition, and certainly not for the purpose of benefiting entrenched interests. What this means in practice, for example, is that someone renting out their home on St. Charles Avenue during Mardi Gras via Airbnb may not have to abide by the long-standing rules applicable to the hotel industry. This might also mean that Tesla may not have to pay middlemen, car dealers, and instead should be allowed to sell directly to consumers. Making these reforms may not be easy or popular given the incumbents. You'll probably hear from a few angry hoteliers and car dealers. But it's critical if you want to embrace innovation as a good thing, not as a threat. A final aspect of the solution when it comes to job creation is to keep the barriers to entry low for anyone looking to work. If you're looking to perform a service and it's not inherently dangerous or complicated, you should be allowed to do it. And here I have in mind primarily occupational licensing schemes. Let me tell you a little story on this front. Elias Zarate is a barber in Memphis, Tennessee. His mother was killed by a drunk driver when he was 10 years old. His father abandoned the family a few years later. Elias never had a chance to finish high school. He had to drop out in order to work to support himself and his younger siblings. His passion is barbering, cutting hair. In 2017, he started working at a higher-end barbershop in downtown Memphis. He was building a client base and improving his reputation until a state inspector stopped by and fined him $1,500 for cutting hair without a license. Later, he was called to a hearing in Nashville, in which he was told that Tennessee requires barbers to have a license, which in turn requires going to barber school, which in turn requires a high school diploma. The state at first rejected Elias's appeals and upheld the fine, tacking on an additional $600 in court costs for good measure. His reaction? I was devastated. I felt like everything I had struggled to build had been snatched from me in the blink of an eye. As I mentioned earlier, this situation involves occupational licensing. However well-intentioned, and all too often it's not, it's bad for service providers and consumers alike. People who want to offer a basic, non-dangerous service, haircuts, guided tours, flower arrangements, you name it, can't do what they want without the state's permission. These hurdles disproportionately hurt minorities, and those with lower incomes, and those with less education, and military spouses who often move from state to state, and still others. And studies have shown that occupational licensing often doesn't even benefit consumers with higher quality or safer services. Well, in Elias's case, I wanted to do something, and so I did. After a little finagling, I actually met Elias and his wife in April of 2018, thanks to the Beacon Center, a free market group in Tennessee. And I personally contributed to his GoFundMe. I wrote about his case in the Memphis Commercial Appeal. I tweeted about it, and I spoke about it, preaching from what little pulpit I had. And the icing on the cake came last summer. After 2 years of litigation, Elias won his case against the Tennessee Board of Cosmetology and Barber Examiners, a government entity whose name alone should convince you of the wisdom of limited government. A court held that it was constitutionally irrational for the government to require barbers to have a high school diploma, especially when they don't require one for cosmetologists. Well, there are a lot of Elias Zarates out there, some of whom may be in Louisiana. And so, to the extent that you can end occupational licensing schemes like this, it'll help many people succeed. And they may well turn into the small business entrepreneurs of the future. So, that's the first big point, making it easier to create jobs and to work. Second big point, make your state a sandbox for innovation and market it as such. There have been a few jurisdictions that have done interesting things along these lines. A great example is Wyoming. Many think of Yellowstone and cowboy ranches when they think of Wyoming, but increasingly they're thinking about innovation. And that's in part because in 2019, the Wyoming legislature passed a law creating what they called a financial technology sandbox for the testing of innovative financial products and services in the state. It explicitly targeted new and emerging technologies like blockchain. This past fall, the Wyoming Banking Board voted to approve the application of Kraken, a cryptocurrency exchange, to become a special purpose depository institution. In English, Kraken became the first cryptocurrency firm in America to become a bank. This decision sent a signal to other financial entrepreneurs everywhere. Wyoming is offering a place for me to create something special. Last year, I had the chance to sit down with Mark Gordon, the governor of Wyoming, in his office in Cheyenne. And he described his vision of making Wyoming a hub for fintech entrepreneurship. I look forward to seeing that vision become a reality in the years to come. And I hope other states mimic this model across the technology sector. A sandbox can also be created at the local level. And perhaps no better example of this exists than in the sun and sand of South Florida. At 5:41 p.m. on December 4th, 2020, a San Francisco Bay Area investor tweeted out the following, and I quote, "Okay guys, hear me out. What if we move Silicon Valley to Miami?" Unquote. Well, 3 hours later, the mayor of Miami, Francis Suarez, replied by quote tweet, "How can I help?" As CNBC later reported, this simple tweet set off a firestorm of activity. Entrepreneurs and investors and other creators started to talk about Miami as an alternative to the traditional locales like Silicon Valley and New York. For some, the talk became action. For instance, Keith Rabois is a prominent tech investor who's been involved in very successful companies like Airbnb, LinkedIn, Lyft, PayPal, Square, and YouTube. On January 4th, 2021, he tweeted, "I have met more interesting new people in Miami in 3 weeks than all of 2020 in the Bay Area." He's certainly not alone in his enthusiasm. Mayor Suarez explained this phenomenon this way, and I quote, "I think the 'how can I help' tweet was sort of an earth-shattering moment because people were like, oh, finally, an elected official who gets it, who understands that having companies that are building wealth and creating high-paying jobs is something that benefits a city." Well, to me, there's no reason why Louisiana, why New Orleans, why other parts of the state can't draw this talent and capture this enthusiasm as well. Indeed, there's a good case to make that we are entering an era of what I would call digital federalism. The idea that states and localities can distinguish themselves, can make themselves more appealing to job creators, and by doing so, compete successfully with counterpart states and localities for scarce talent. And I would argue that this trend is being driven, and will continue to be driven, by a few key factors. First, the pandemic has illustrated to many employers and employees alike that many jobs can be done from anywhere. And this means that innovation need not any longer be confined to a few places. Second, tax policy at the federal and state level has illustrated the advantages of particular jurisdictions. For instance, Congress's limitation of the state and local tax deduction and Florida's lack of a state income tax make the Sunshine State more appealing than high-tax states like New York and New Jersey. And third, lifestyle is increasingly important to many people. Lifestyle may mean better weather to some, it may mean a more laid-back atmosphere to others, or it may mean a more affordable place to raise a family to others still. However people perceive it, there's a growing sense that if you have a strong internet connection, you can do your job anywhere you want to do it. And that actually brings me to the third major point. Broadband needs to be ubiquitous across Louisiana and across the country. You can't have a 21st century economy without 21st century digital infrastructure. If people are going to move somewhere, they want to know that they'll have a reliable connection to the outside world from their new location. That's especially true if they're going to start and operate a business. I saw a good example of this during a visit to West Virginia back in 2017 with Senator Shelley Moore Capito. We visited Capon Springs, a small town that didn't have broadband, and I remember meeting a resort owner who increasingly was having trouble attracting customers. The natural beauty of the setting was a draw, but in the evenings, guests wanted to be able to do things online, to check their email or to stream Netflix, and they couldn't do that. Well, by contrast, we also visited Wardensville, just 15 minutes away from Capon Springs. Wardensville is a town connected with optical fiber, and this greatly helped residents and one business I visited. This business does transcriptions for video appearances on cable news networks, which requires the download of a huge amount of video. Well, with reliable high-capacity fiber, they can do that seamlessly. And this has enabled them to hire numerous people from the local community college. And when I visited, they were looking to expand into a second building. Two nearby towns, two different fates, attributable in part to the digital divide. Well, during my time at the FCC, we made closing the digital divide our top priority. And we got results in this area, with millions more Americans having access to broadband when I left in 2021 than had it in 2017. But there's still more work to do. We set up the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, a $20 billion program to help do some of this work and narrow this gap. And phase one of that program concluded just before I left. It will connect over 5 million Americans with high-quality service, up to gigabit service. But phase two of that program will be important in filling in partially served areas, areas where you may have broadband, but your neighbor down the road does not. Well, here too, a state has an important role to play. Remember, the biggest roadblock to broadband deployment in some cases is that there simply isn't a business case for private companies to raise capital and to build in certain locations. To the extent that Louisiana can adopt forward-thinking regulatory reforms, that can make a big difference in helping to make that business case. For instance, dig once policies can ensure that conduit can be laid cheaply when a road is being dug up for repairs. Quicker and cheaper access to utility poles owned by municipalities is a huge factor in speeding up deployment. And it helps to streamline the process for wireless infrastructure so that big towers and small cells alike aren't stuck in indefinite regulatory limbo. These reforms may seem arcane, but they can be critical drivers for the construction of next-generation networks. Now, aside from regulatory reforms like these, a state can also allocate public funds to help connect those on the wrong side of the digital divide. For example, if the Louisiana Broadband Office uses any state funds that are available to essentially match the funding that will come from the FCC through phase two of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, that would be a powerful combination to help connect unserved or underserved folks in the Pelican State. Speaking of Pelican, I don't want to test my host's patience, so I'll wrap it up here. In sum, make it easier to create jobs and to work. Create a sandbox for innovation, and ensure that everyone has access to the internet and next generation technologies. These are a few basic tools that Louisiana might consider in making the Bayou just as much a hub for innovation as the Bay Area and Boston. As I know well, Louisiana already has so much going for it, drawing on its rich history and culture. An economy focused as well on the future, just as the past, would be a powerful combination and would empower entrepreneurs in the state to laisser le bon temps rouler. Here's hoping it comes to pass. Thank you very much for having me today.
What great comments and thoughts, as expected, from Chairman Pai. Thank you so much. Much to be learned from all of those conversations. Now, there's more to be learned yet, and some of you have sent some questions in. I have those. If you still have some, we still have some time to collect those. info@pelicaninstitute.org. If you see some things get handed up, that's what's happening. Before we bring Chairman Pai back up for Q&A, I'd like to welcome my colleague, who is the director of the Pelican Institute Center for Technology and Innovation Policy, Eric Peterson. Eric.
Hey, Daniel. Glad to be here with you today.
Glad you are here. I like the tie. We've got basketballs and Pelicans.
Yeah, March Madness. What better to wear?
That's right. Very good. Well, I know folks are interested to hear from Chairman Pai some more. So let's bring Chairman Pai back up.
Yeah,
Ajit.
Hey, how's it going?
Hey, Chairman.
It's great to see you. Thank you so much. It was a great speech.
Oh, thanks. You say that to all the former chairmen, I'm sure. But thanks so much. I really appreciate the chance to speak with you and to be with you today.
Well, great. Lots to talk about. I know we could go. We've got some time to dive into some questions. I think Eric's going to kick us off.
Great. Yeah, the people of Louisiana are so excited to hear from me today. One of the things coming is the American Rescue Plan, where billions of dollars are going to be coming down into Louisiana. Some of that money is set aside for infrastructure like broadband. I've gotten a lot of questions on what's the best way to spend that money, especially with the kind of conversation going on with the broadband maps right now.
It's a great question. So number one, I think the mapping effort that the FCC is involved in, which I started last year, is going to be absolutely critical. And that includes, of course, Louisiana, trying to figure out what parts of the state are unserved and what parts of the state are partially served. So certainly I would work as closely as you can with the FCC, with the mapping team in particular, to figure out exactly what parts of the state need to be addressed. Secondly, to the extent that funding comes to Louisiana and you're interested in using that for broadband deployment, I would definitely encourage lawmakers and the Louisiana Broadband Office, whoever the decision makers might be, to work very closely with the FCC to match efforts. As I mentioned, phase 2 of the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund is going to be filling in those parts of the country and those parts of the state that are only partially served. So, for example, if you're out in Covington, and you have broadband, your neighbor doesn't, you're filling in that little color, so to speak. They're going to be absolutely critical to work with the FCC to make sure that if the FCC is spending $1 through the phase 2 of the auction, you'll be able to match it, for example, with $1 or 50 cents or whatever. So I'm happy to facilitate those connections with the relevant decision makers at the FCC. I think it's important for Louisiana and the agency to work closely together to make sure that the dollars you're about to get are stretched as far as they possibly can be.
Yeah, you're always one making connections, especially in rural Louisiana.
I'm happy to do it. Hey, if you have some Cafe Du Monde coffee, anything is possible, right?
That can be arranged. Very good. Well, we have a question, Ajit. Here's one. One of your hallmarks was transparency and working with Democrat and Republican members at the FCC. What lessons can you share broadly about working across the aisle, working across ideological divides to advance key priorities?
I think the number one thing is to recognize that these issues, at least, are generally nonpartisan in nature. I had the privilege of traveling to 49 states. Oh, sorry, that was my puppy, Ginger. Who's
very excited for Ginger.
She's very excited about the Solutions Summit as well. So, but I had the chance to visit 49 states in the territories of Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. And one of the things I found is that the core question about the digital divide is one that's nonpartisan in nature. Making sure that Americans have access to the internet. It's not a Republican issue or Democratic issue. And so generally speaking, I tried to approach issues in that spirit to make sure that all of us were on the same page. Secondly, I would try to find different issues aside from broadband deployment where all of us could claim a win. And so, for example, if I knew that there was a Democratic commissioner with a particular concern in mind, I could try to advance the ball by working with him or her. So a good example of that was we noticed that there were a lot of interns that were interested in coming to the FCC who couldn't, essentially because they couldn't afford to pay their own way. These were unpaid internships. So I worked with one of the Democratic commissioners to ensure that we had a stipend essentially for those interns to enable them to come. And that actually had some nice spillover effects to some of the substantive issues that we were working with on a policy basis. So he was more willing to meet me halfway, for example, on some of those issues. So those are the kinds of things you can do. It's more EQ, I would say, than substance, but EQ actually matters a lot when it comes to politics and policy.
Absolutely. By the way, I think if folks are interested, they can follow Ginger on Twitter as well. So make sure you follow Chairman Pai and Ginger on Twitter. Both great follows if you're doing that.
Yeah, she's, in addition to barking loud, she also tweets a lot, not a lot of bulldogs. So sorry about that.
That's great.
Yeah, we're very glad that her tweets don't load one word at a time. So I know you've got some more time off, not that you're not FCC chairman anymore. And I'm sure you've been watching a lot of March Madness. Unfortunately, LSU didn't win yesterday. Yeah, people were very disappointed down here.
My bracket is so shot, it's ridiculous. Kansas
terrible
by 34, I think it was. So yeah, it's a sad day for me.
Yeah, absolutely. But if you're watching March Madness, you've seen ads after ads for 5G, and 5G is one of the hallmarks of what you did at the FCC. You just had the C-band auction, raised $80 billion. So one of the questions kind of have is, what do you think the future is for 5G and spectrum policy?
I think the future is incredibly bright, especially here in the United States. We adopted a few years ago what I call the 5G Fast Plan that involved making more spectrum available for the commercial marketplace, making it easier to deploy wireless infrastructure like small cells, and making sure that we could deploy more fiber, optical fiber, to connect all that internet traffic back to the core of the networks. And that's as a result of all of our efforts. We've held groundbreaking spectrum auctions. You mentioned the biggest one, the C-band auction, the largest auction in American history, $81 billion raised for the US Treasury. We've also just seen a huge explosion in terms of the small cell infrastructure that's out there. And in terms of optical fiber, we set records in 2018 and 2019 for fiber deployment. And as a result, with apologies to all the viewers out there, now you're seeing a lot of these companies take those building blocks of innovation and put them together to offer services in terms of 5G. And so you're seeing a lot of people, T-Mobile, for example, claims to serve 250 million Americans with the 5G network. Some of the other companies are trying to do that as well. And so it's an exciting time. From a consumer perspective, I think the faster speeds are going to be obvious, 100 times, for example, faster speeds in 4G, much lower latency. So when you click a link on your phone, it'll pop up a lot quicker than it does on a 4G network. But in the early days, I think the enterprise side is we're going to see 5G really pop. For example, managed transportation networks or manufacturing, things like that are going to be pretty powerful use cases. So the future is bright here in the United States, and I'm glad that the FCC helped lead the charge.
That's great. All right, we have another question from a viewer. Americans are perhaps more mobile than any time ever before, and telework, may be here to stay. So here's the question. If you were a politician here in Louisiana, what would be your pitch for people or businesses looking to move to Louisiana? And also, and this may be the most important part of the question, how can we recruit you to come here?
I'm sold, believe me. Like I said, I have a soft spot in my heart for Louisiana, for New Orleans in particular. And my wife and her family and my own family are kind of on the East Coast. We're right here. But look, if it were up to me, I'd be sitting in the Garden District sipping a mint julep at the Columns right now. So
excellent.
But no, for me, I think, as I said in my remarks, I truly think that we're on the cusp of something big with digital federalism. And one of the things I've noticed in my years in Washington is that whenever people ask, "Oh, where did you move here from?" and I say New Orleans, a smile comes over their face. Like there's sort of a very warm halo effect, if you will, for the city, for the state. And that's a really powerful thing. To the extent that everybody has access to technology, I really believe that Louisiana has a truly powerful 1-2 punch in store where you can say, look, we've got a great lifestyle. We've got fantastic food and architecture and culture and just the collegiality of the people paired with the broadband and other infrastructure that allows you to do your job no matter where you are, whether you're a high frequency trader or a tech investor or a startup entrepreneur. You can do that here in Louisiana. And so I think there are a lot of secular trends. I mentioned the pandemic and tax policy, but all of that is congealing, I think, at the right time for Louisiana. So, even though some people might think, well, technology innovation, you're kind of limited to Silicon Valley and the Bay Area and New York City. That's not true anymore. And I think, especially coming out of the pandemic, a lot of tech employers in particular are realizing we're kind of agnostic now to where our workforce is. As long as they can do the job in a way that makes them happy and productive, that's fine with us. So I think Louisiana has a chance to step right on up with the best of them.
Yeah, we know once we're in crawfish season, once you have your first crawfish boil, who can go anywhere else?
My God, those are the things I miss a lot. Just the crawfish dumped right on the newspaper, just start shucking and sucking the head. It's oh man.
Absolutely. So one of the places that are trying to attract to top tech talent are a lot of rural places in Louisiana. What do you think their ability for satellite internet to serve those people was one of the most exciting things you did at your time at the FCC?
I'm really excited about the potential for satellite in some of these rural areas. I mean, there are parts of the country, parts of Louisiana, where you just might never find a business case for laying optical fiber. And so for those parts of the country, we've got a fundamental choice to make. Do we leave them without any access to technology, or do we encourage innovation? And we chose the latter path when I was at the FCC. The first ever low Earth orbit satellite constellations were approved under my leadership. Companies like SpaceX and OneWeb, and now Amazon's Kuiper coming to the fore. And I think it's going to be really powerful. Obviously, for residential broadband, we want everybody to have access to the internet at home, but also for some of the critical services that come from rural America. Precision agriculture is a good example of that. I think many people in big urban areas, when they hear agriculture, they think of a slow-moving analog tractor. But I'm telling you, I've been on a lot of farms and ranches across this country, from Idaho to Virginia. The current farm is a connected farm in the best of circumstances. So if we can leverage satellite technology to provide people the ability to guide combines remotely, to analyze soil moisture and the like, using technology, that's going to be really powerful. So I think rural America has a great deal to benefit from when it comes to satellite.
Excellent. Very exciting stuff indeed.
No question. This is great. So it feels like we're living in a different world. Satellites and drones and stuff we talked about in, Back to the Future.
It's unbelievable, isn't it? And especially how far we've come so fast. I grew up in the era of 3 television channels and a wired phone into the wall, and now it's just, it almost feels like we're living in the era of the Jetsons, as I pointed out on Twitter recently.
That's right.
That was, again, another great tweet. So go follow him.
My kids found an old wired phone in the attic somewhere and were just fascinated by it. They just, what does this cord do? And what are these buttons? And it was great.
Oh my God. There's a great YouTube clip, if you can find it, where they give some, I think it's tweens, a rotary phone and ask them to figure out how to make a phone call. And just fantastic to watch that. And I'm sure we did that with our parents' generation of technology, but the kids now are digital natives, of course. So you think about some of those technologies that we used.
Absolutely. Well, I want to shift gears a little bit with a question. We have, you talked in your speech about occupational licensure. I know certainly you're here talking about innovation technology, but your interest, I know, because we've talked about it before, are wide and varied. Talk to us a little bit more about licensure, why that's an important issue, and what your sort of view on it is.
It's so important. And I know that some of this strays beyond the FCC's bailiwick. And so sometimes I get questions, well, why do you care so much about this issue? But to me, it was just a fundamental question of economic freedom. If you are willing to work to help put food on the table for yourself and your family, and you can find a customer who's willing to pay you for that work, to me, it seems like the state shouldn't erect artificial roadblocks to enabling yourself and your family to do that. And so I found all kinds of occupational licensing schemes that stood in the way. I gave the example of Elias Zarate, and I'm telling you, there's no more powerful argument to be made for the free market and for limited government than talking to people like him who really love to do barbering, but were prevented from doing it because of an antiquated scheme in Tennessee that required him to get a license, required him to pay thousands of dollars to get a class to get the license, required him to have a high school diploma in order to get the class done. I mean, it's just a ridiculous scheme. And so to me, at least, that's one of the ways of empowering your citizens. It might not be technology oriented, but I'm telling you that these things have a major impact for those who otherwise might not be able to work within the economy. And so let's enable them to do what they love to do. Similarly, with the gig economy, so to speak, I remember very clearly a trip I took to New Orleans about 3 years ago, and I took an Uber from the airport to my hotel in the city. And my Uber driver was a woman named Trina, and I asked her, well, how do you like working for Uber, and what is it that you like about doing it? And she said, well, I previously was a baker to make ends meet for myself and my family. I liked, I mean, I could do it pretty well. I had a satisfied customer base, but I didn't really enjoy doing it. And also I was at the mercy of my clients. If they called up on a Friday and needed a cake for a Sunday, I'd have to hop to it because that's the client. Whereas now she has much more flexibility and she actually earns more. And so to me, at least, the liberation of the individual to find what it is that he or she loves to do and enabling them to do that without the state erecting these roadblocks is so critical. So there are also macro effects as well. So for example, telehealth, there might be a great healthcare provider in Mississippi that's prohibited from offering services in Louisiana to patients, or vice versa. To break down those medical licensure schemes could be a powerful way, especially coming out of the pandemic, to ensure that healthcare providers don't have to limit themselves to within their state lines. They can provide expertise anywhere. That's really powerful across some of the states I've seen, and I would love for Louisiana to benefit from that as well.
Yeah,
That's great.
Per usual, he gives us the best segues. We're going to have Adam Thea from the Mercatus Center talk a little bit about permissionless innovation, which is exactly what you're talking about, not that Mother May I approach to government, but people being entrepreneurs and putting their life in their own hands and being masters of their own destiny.
Well, I'm just blathering about it. Adam literally wrote the book on it, so you did the very best. And I think it's such a fundamental principle that, to go back to one of your first questions, I think it resonates across the political aisle. I mean, I think everybody understands that human desire to do something for yourself and to be able to provide for your family in a way you see fit. And yeah, permissionless innovation is the key touchstone of all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. So one other thing you got to was telehealth, another kind of hallmark of your FCC. We just got a telehealth paper, which is up right now. People can take a quick look at it. Daniel talked about we had over 2,200 doctors take advantage of telehealth because we removed some red tape and we've got some ideas on how to make that permanent. But what do you think the future is for telehealth? Is it something that's going to stick around kind of post-pandemic, or are we going to go back to seeing our doctors?
I think it's going to be much more of the norm than the exception in the future. And I think the pandemic has only underscored how critical it is to have connected care solutions. Back in 2018, President Kennedy's FCC Chairman Newt Minow and I wrote an op-ed in which we suggested that the country needed to put a priority on telehealth. Increasingly, the healthcare model is being inverted, where care is provided not where the bricks and mortar facility is, but where the patient might happen to be. In addition to providing extended access to healthcare, it also can improve outcomes and save costs for the system and have all kinds of other serendipitous benefits. And so one of the things I tried to do at the FCC was to make telehealth a centerpiece of our connected care of our broadband efforts. We increased the budget, for example, for our rural healthcare program for the first time in a generation to recognize that telehealth was becoming a more dominant use case for broadband. In the CARES Act, COVID-19 inspired legislation from Congress, they gave us authority to set up a new telehealth program, and we did that, allocating $200 million to 539 providers across the state, including some in Louisiana. And more than that, what we try to do is emphasize that we need to have much more collaboration across the federal government and with state governments. So I actually partnered very much with the VA, the Veterans Affairs Department, with HHS, and with other entities to make sure that we were all speaking with one voice when it came to things like telehealth, reimbursement, licensure, et cetera. So that, as I said, telehealth can emerge from the pandemic as one of the more silver lining aspects, I think, of this dismal time. So I think the future is very bright. I think both Democrats and Republicans get that. And let's see what we can do to make that the norm.
I love that. All right, we have another question here. Very informed viewers here. I love it. One of your hallmarks is even though you were chair of a government agency, you didn't look to sort of grow it, but rather you looked to empower the private sector. So what lessons from that experience, would you apply maybe to other government agencies or lawmakers and agency leaders who might be watching right now?
I think part of it involves just dedicated management that if you're the top of that pyramid, you really have to make sure that you're doing everything you can to do more with less. And part of that involved Congress setting our budget. So we are, of course, a creature of Congress in that regard. But also personally, one of the things I made it a priority to do was to make sure that our staff knew that I very much valued their public service, that I was with them every step of the way, even though I knew that they were doing a lot of different things, they were always super busy, that wasn't being lost on people at the top echelon of the agency. And so it might sound somewhat, obscure or cheesy, but one of the things I really wanted to do was to let them know in deed and in word that I was there with them, attending retirement functions, making sure that I recognized them in small groups just to say thank you, hosting them for coffees and things like that. I know, like I said, it might sound small, but these are the kinds of things over time that can enable everybody to feel like they have a vested interest in the organization's success. Even though you might be more streamlined, smaller, nonetheless, I think it's important for the agency heads to be able to do that. Similarly, to think very creatively about organizational structure. One of the things I noticed during my many years as a staffer and then as a commissioner was that the economists at the agency didn't have a dedicated office. There was an office of general counsel for the lawyers. There was an office of engineering technology for the engineers. But for economists, they're kind of sprinkled throughout the agency, and no one really gave them a seat at the table when it came to policymaking. But I changed that through the Office of Economics and Analytics. So now, whenever the agency is thinking about doing something, an economist or a data scientist or both can be there at the table saying, here's what I think. A very simple way that didn't involve increasing the headcount, but simply centralizing the function so that they felt that they had a stake in the enterprise. So those are just some of the few things you can do. I think the notion that smaller agencies are necessarily less able to address the challenges is a false one. I think we demonstrated that we could do both, do more with less over the last 4 years.
Yeah, definitely working with your staff. You could see the passion for closing the digital divide and working on all these great issues. So well done. I think my kind of last question is, you're not FCC chairman anymore. There's been some rumors that you'll be taking over for Judge Judy. What is next for Ajit Pai?
I've been lobbying hard. I'm telling you, Judge Judy, you're being a guest host on Jeopardy, you name it. But no, I've been having a lot of great conversations with people across the different sectors of the economy to try to figure out what I want to be when I grow up, as some often say. And just fantastic to get some feedback from people on what I could do, what I should do. Of course, my mother has her own views on that. I should go to medical school and finally hang up the shingle of being a lawyer and policy wonk. But I'm ruling that out, of course, preemptively. But I've been very grateful to all the folks who have made time for me over the last couple of months to help me try to figure out this next phase of the adventure. And whatever it is, I have faith that it's going to be something that's rewarding. And I certainly feel like the Forrest Gump of the communications sector thus far, and hopefully whatever it is that comes next, it'll involve something similarly exciting.
I love it. Well, we have just about a minute left. Leave that open to you for any closing thoughts or inspiration as we head on to the rest of our day.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the Pelican Institute. When I was in office, it was such a joy to work with you, Daniel, and Eric, and the entire team on advancing some thoughtful policies that would help make consumers in this country better off. The work that you do isn't easy. I know that sometimes there's so many different issues competing for people's attention, so many things that legislators and policymakers are worried about. But to have steadfast advocates like you in the Pelican State who are willing to take the heat for sometimes doing what's right instead of doing what's easy, that's so very critical. So I hope that you and those who support you will never underestimate the contribution you make to the public discourse. It's people like you who are in the arena, as former President Theodore Roosevelt once said, and I, for one, am very glad that you are.
Well, thank you very much. Very kind words, and we're obviously feel the same about working with you. And hopefully, this is not the last conversation we have, but the start of many more in whatever the next phase of your career is.
Oh, like I said, that would be lagniappe. I would love it.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you again for a great address, for a great Q&A, and go enjoy that pup. And we'll look forward to talking with you again soon.
Thanks so much. Take care. Be well.
Thank you. You too. All right. Wow, that was great. I just love talking with Ajit. Now, Eric is going to go because in a minute, he's got a panel to lead.
Yeah, I got some great guests to talk about permissionless innovation, a lot of stuff that Ajit cheered us up for.
All right. Well, you have doing that. Don't leave anywhere yet. And you can join Eric in just a few minutes. We've got one more speaker before we head into panels. Reminder, you're going to go into that sessions button when it's time. Don't do it yet. All right, so great stuff, lots to think about from Chairman Pai, and lots more to come here over the next hour or so on Tech and Innovation Day on Big Solutions Mini Summits. In the meantime, let me introduce our next speaker. We are thrilled to be joined by Jennifer Huddleston, who is the Director of Technology and Innovation Policy at the American Action Forum. Now, she also has a connection here to our region as Teach for America. She taught children here in the Mississippi Delta and cares deeply about the digital divide, especially as it relates to education. She has expertise in antitrust and data privacy, Section 230, a big discussion that's been going on recently. And one thing I do want to note, she notes in her Twitter bio, she has a passion for scooters. Now, Eric and I have a little disagreement. He likes to call it micromobility, and I find that silly. So scooters it is. In the meantime, some great words of wisdom coming. Please welcome Jennifer Huddleston.
There have been growing concerns about what to do with the problems associated with the digital divide, particularly in light of the COVID-19 pandemic, when more people than ever before find themselves relying on internet access for education and employment opportunities. Many policymakers are asking how they can help alleviate the problems faced by those who lack internet access or whose internet access is at insufficient speeds to be considered broadband. At a federal level, we've seen great leadership from the FCC in making broadband more available by allowing additional access to spectrum and working with the private sector through programs like the Keep Americans Connected pledge early in the pandemic. And now looking to continue to build on the light touch approach to regulation that encourages innovation and investment for new technologies that may solve problems where traditional fixed line broadband is prohibitively expensive. This includes exciting new ideas such as better satellite internet and 5G. But the digital divide looks very different in different communities. As a result, state and local policymakers may be uniquely positioned to examine what barriers to deployment of.
Well, of course, on Technology and Innovation Day, we'd have a tech glitch. If you're joining us here in South Louisiana, you know the weather has gotten a little crazy on us. Not sure if that's the issue. Don't worry, we will come back to Jennifer in just a little while once we have that fixed. Apologies. This is, just par for the course as we deal with a virtual event. But don't worry, Jennifer has a lot of great stuff to say, and we'll come back to her very soon. In the meantime, let's go ahead and move into our panel, a brief introduction. And then after I'm done, I will ask you again to click that sessions button over to the left of your screen. The panel discussion, you're not going to want to miss this. This is about making Louisiana a tech and innovation destination. Eric Peterson, my colleague from the Center for Technology and Innovation Policy, who you just met, will be joined by Benjamin Hart, who is the Deputy Director at the Utah Governor's Office of Economic Development. Lots of great stuff happening in Utah on innovation policy. Be a chance to learn some best practices from around the country. We'll also be joined by Eric Fulton, who is a fellow at the Frontier Policy Center. And Eric is also a great expert and thought leader on these issues. And finally, as Chairman Pai mentioned in our conversation, Adam Thierer, who is the Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. Adam literally did write the book on permissionless innovation, a great thinker, really a number of books you're going to want to read after you hear him talk, no doubt. He'd be happy, I'm sure, to sell you some of those. So great panel coming right up. If you're ready now, go ahead and click that sessions button, and Eric will see you right there on the other side. Thanks for joining the Pelican Institute Big Solutions Mini Summit Tech and Innovation Day. I'll see you soon.